and they're going to be doing a talk on the women's role in the Civil War. And they have quite a lot of information. They have books up here, so after the program, I'm sure you can chat, maybe browse through the books at that time. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Wyatt. Take over. Thank you.
You must really want to know something about women in the Civil War. It's a lousy day. But one of the few times that wearing wool seems to make sense. We want to cover a lot of ground and a lot of different things. If I don't speak loudly enough, or just please tell me to shout. My wife Kathy, my daughter Virginia. I also have my nephew Derek here. We also have 2 or 3 other family members who do this kind of thing, including my sister who's arriving as we speak. And why would we do this kind of thing? Well, we'll get into that at the very end of this. And I doubt we're going to convince any of you to go out and do this, but at least we'll give you some idea of why it is that we find it kind of fun and interesting and satisfying and whatever. Bet you didn't think this was going to be a quiz. We're not going to go into maybe the causes of the Civil War so much, but let me ask you if you got any ideas why people fought it.
States' rights was one.
States' rights?
He's a ringer.
Let me frame the argument just a little bit. The outfit that we generally portray is the Madison, Louisiana Light Artillery. They were better known also as the Tips, as in Tipperaries, because a lot of these folks came from the docks in New Orleans, but prior to that, from Ireland. So almost none of them had anything to do with owning slaves. Very few of them had anything to do with states' rights. So why on earth would they go to fight for a country that they are newly arrived in? Why would they do that? Perhaps adventure, money certainly, and because their buddy did it. One of the reasons, well, we'll get into the reasons that we started doing this, particularly, as I say, later, but you know, when you look, and I'm relying in large measure on some of the things that we've been reading over the past weeks, and I urge you to hear what it is we're saying, but at the same time, go out and look this stuff up yourself. We have people in our unit that profoundly disagree with me on a lot of different things. We have some folks who think the real beast of the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln, and have been very vocal about it. I tend to think on the opposite terms, but you know, if you look at some of the basic information, I think it's kind of interesting that 1/2 of the 9 million people in the South were wealthy planters. Those are the people who started this, essentially. And 1/4 of the white families in the South owned slaves. And 1/2 of those owned 5 slaves or less. So most of the people who went off to put a gun in their hands had nothing to do with slavery. And yet they went to go support a war that essentially was about that. One of the great ironies of this war is that one of the reasons the South went to war, to win the war, they had to become a lot like what they hated. What they hated about the North was that they were much more urban. They were sometimes Catholic. They had lots of different nationalities up there. They basically thought the North was going to hell. In some measure, they still do. The War of Northern Aggression has not ended in some places, and we'll get into that a little bit later too. But the things they most hated about the North, they were forced to do to try and fight that war. Any idea who had the first draft in America? That'd be the South. The first income tax in America, that'd be the Confederacy. The the first impressment of slaves. At the end of the war, they also started recruiting slaves to be soldiers. At the beginning of the war, that would have been absolutely out of the question. But as the war went on, more and more, they went to do some things that they completely hated. That's the reason they broke away from the Union. They also were forced to do a lot of things that were complete anathema to them. They, in the course of the war, had to start planning food. Up until then, they were planning things that you could wear and you could smoke, because that's how they earned the money. But as the war went on, it became increasingly obvious that they had to plan some things to keep themselves sustainable. There was an entire year when they could not make enough shoes. Why? Because they didn't have enough skins to tan. At one point, they were using squirrels, alligators, and dogs to try and make enough leather of one sort or another to put on people's feet.
And if you were a slave, you wore willow bark shoes. Really comfortable.
But more to the point of what we wanted to talk about today, the war changed for both the North and the South, but in much more profound ways, different ways, the role of women. Before the war, you would not have had women working in any of the means in which they went on to later on. For instance, in 1861, there was a factory in Richmond that used to cut a lot of uniform cloth, but the way it got made into uniforms was they shipped it out to 2,000 women in Richmond, another 3,000 in Atlanta, and thousands elsewhere to make all of these things hand-sewn into uniforms. Women went on to all kinds of different things, making uniforms and tents, and more importantly, they were trying to run farms while their men were off trying to fight the war. And they're trying to run these farms without a lot of the implements because you had to do them without replacements for all of the essentials: hoes, plows, wagons. So there was a lot of innovation going on, a lot of very interesting thinking, but women being forced to do things they'd never really considered doing. And the difference between North and South would be the difference between lots and none. In the North, certainly women were forced to do a lot of different jobs, but there was not want. The North had plenty of everything. In the South, exactly the opposite. One of the things, please take a look at all of the books that we brought. This one was given to me back 11 years ago. We were doing a documentary at a WXXI about war letters, things that people had sent to and from every war we ever fought. And this particular one is a series of correspondence between a man who was serving in the Union Army and a woman who would eventually become his wife. And it's very homey. You can tell that neither one of these people had a lot of education, but there's a very real, very down-home quality to it. We talked about the reasons for the war. As this gentleman, Justice Madison, was writing to his girlfriend, one of the things he wrote in a letter of late 1862, "This war must be put down, and I am one among the many who have left their homes for a while to fight for our country's freedom, not as our forefathers fought to gain it, but to retain it. And when that is accomplished, I'm coming home to friends whom I presume will be glad to see me by that time." Nothing about slavery in that. He's basically fighting to regain the freedom of the country. States' rights, maybe not so much. Keeping the Union, yes. Wanted to read just one other thing here, and this is two other things. If you're wondering what life was like in 1863 near Homer, which is in Portland County, it gives you a little bit of an idea of just how different life would have been back then for a lot of folks. This is Mary writing back to her boyfriend. "I'm quite well, like sewing here very well. Think that I shall stay all summer. I've been here 7 weeks, have not been home yet, but think that I shall go next week. They're having quite a time in Solon with the diphtheria. Mr. Grant has lost 2 children, Mrs. Gardner 2, Helen and Albert. Aaron and George have had it but are getting better. Mrs. Brown has lost 1. 3 of Mr. Adkins' boys were sick and others in the place. At last I heard it was raging in Freetown very hard. There's a number that died. We don't get much more news now. How I wish that it would come to a close. That's kind of hard to picture, but a diphtheria epidemic, this is not the only summer. There's about 3 or 4 years of letters here, and in every summer you read about somebody dying of diphtheria. That would have been true either north or south, but that's the hardship that this particular woman is talking about. I just wanted to read you one other one that was by turns kind of flirting and then very serious. And she's thanking her boyfriend for his picture. I should have known it had it been with 10,000 more. I think it's a very good one. It will not be flattery if I say that I think you make a very good-looking soldier, for flattery of any kind I do not believe in or approve of. I read the war news with much interest now, for I know that many of my friends will be engaged in the present battles, but they may all come out safe shall be my prayer. I know not that some may now be lying in the battlefield wounded. Oh, the misery that this war, one heart cannot tell, for there are so many that suffer. If I could take care of the wounded, I know that I should be a poor hand, but if I could do what I could do, it would be some consolation. But I'm so far north that I can do nothing. Well, it's time for the evening meeting, and I must close, hoping to hear that you are well soon. I bid thee good night. Mary Hatch.
There's a young woman here who had brought a book also of letters. Would you like to stand up and tell them a little bit about your book? Would you like to stand up and tell them about your book of letters?
That's me.
Oh, that's
your book
yours.
of letters. I'm so sorry.
I'm
That's what
sorry.
happens in the Civil War. Only the rich could have glasses.
Since you're going to be talking, maybe for the sake of the camera, you could come up here and just do this in front of the microphone.
Okay.
You bet.
Just briefly, I didn't expect to do this until the end, and I didn't want to interrupt you guys.
No, please, please, it fits right in.
I didn't write this book. Carter Van Vleck wrote the book. He wrote it 150 years ago, and the family has had the letters ever since. He wrote his wife twice a week for 2 years. And so because these are very intimate letters between a husband and wife, they have a different flavor, I think, than the boyfriend-girlfriend letter is. And so you get almost as much of a picture of her as you do of him. I was just looking for his reference to Mary Walker because he had run into Mary, and he has some very decided opinions about Mary Walker, whoever is going to portray it.
Yes.
But I don't know. I started in 1994, and I fell in love with the guy. John will tell you that I have 2 loves. John is one, and Carter Van Vleck's the other. And so for 18 years now, I've been working on an edition of the letters. So this came out, I got this on Friday. It's the only copy at this point, but it's online. There's some flyers back there. And he was a lawyer, so he's very articulate, and he's highly detailed. So you get the sense that you're walking through this because he wanted to give his wife, Patty, the same pictures that he was seeing and the same experiences that he was experiencing. So thank you very much for the time.
Do you have a passage you'd like to read?
Well, there was just a brief one. He's in the hospital and the ladies come.
Would you like it read?
I think I'd better not at this point. If I can find the Mary Walker one, I think it's a better example. But I'll do that at the end if anybody wants me to do it, okay? Thank you for the invitation. That's
Thank
super.
you very much. That fits right in with everything.
Thank you.
As Wyatt, my husband, said, and yes, I am his wife, and yes, I do dress as a male out on the field, and I do dress appropriately. Back when the Civil War began, there were a lot of women that wanted to get into the war. A lot of it was for money. mainly because a Union soldier could earn $13 a month. But a woman, as a laundress, a maid, housekeeper, if she earned half of that, she was lucky. So most of the women that went in were very, very poor, working class, and they went in for the money. Not like today. They didn't have any physicals. So, of course, a doctor would look at them and say, "You put your hands out for me? Over? Let me see you use this finger. Good, she can shoot a gun, she's in." Or, "He can shoot a gun, he's in." Women who were well endowed had to literally bind their bust. I'm one of the more fortunate, I'm not well endowed. So it doesn't make any difference. Coat fits over, can't tell there's anything there. Great. Some women had to pad, and they would pad the front of the pants along with binding. They'd cut their hair because at that point, their hair was supposed to be long. No bangs, always up off the neck. Only time they could have it down is when they went to bed. And even then, they would sometimes, if it was long enough, braid it so that it wouldn't get all messy, so that when they woke up, it was in some kind of a neat order. When they went in, they were given their clothes, their uniform. They were given a gun. They were maybe sent off for a little bit of training, and off they went. They did have fingerless gloves for the wintertime. And since I portray with the Madison, Louisiana, as my belt buckle so says, I would say to y'all, y'all have a very cold, cold weather up here. I brought my fingerless gloves, but I don't know, my shoes is about to wear out soon. And I portray Lenny Bombard on the field. The women had different roles, and as Wyatt alluded to, out on the home front, they had to take over the farm. And they did a lot of the sewing for the soldiers, especially knitting, socks, nightshirts. They rolled bandages, and a lot of the supplies that came were literally farmed out to them by a multitude of different women. But some of them that we'd like to touch base on, we put like in our outline. So we have some journalists and authors and poets that we'd like to touch base. And our daughter Virginia would like to talk on Harriet Beecher Stowe a little bit and Louisa May Alcott.
I'm doing that now?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
'Tis for you.
I am mostly dressed as a Civil War lady would be. With the cape and everything that I'm wearing, I would have been one of the wealthy. For the sake of this, I'm going to take off the bonnet because I'm just not used to it. I normally, when we reenact, I am one of the men because if I get a chance to shoot a cannon, I'm going to take it.
Excitement, another reason women joined the war.
We will go more into the dress later on of women. Lots of layers. But my parents asked me if I could join up and talk about women in the war. And they gave me the outline and said, who would you like to do? And I said, well, I've read both of these authors. I'm an English major. The woman who spoke earlier, I actually had as a teacher at Brockport. And I've read both of these women. I love their books. So I'll start with Harriet Beecher Stowe, which most people should know who she is. Harriet Beecher Stowe was born in Litchfield, Connecticut on June 14th, 1811. She was born to very religious parents and had 8 siblings. She attended an all-girls school led by her older sister Catherine, and all 7 of her brothers became ministers. Even though she attended the all-girls seminary, she received a traditionally male education, which included language arts and math. When she was 21, she moved out to Ohio to be with her father, and there joined the Semicolon Club, which was a literary salon and social club, in which she met her husband, Calvin Stowe. They were married on January 6, 1836. They were both very ardent critics of slavery and allowed their house to be part of the Underground Railroad. Together they had 7 children. But Harriet Beecher Stowe is much more well known for her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was first published as an anti-slavery journal called the National Era in weekly installments from June 5th to April 1st, from 1851 to 1852. And it was initially titled The Man That Was a Thing, or Life Among the Lowly. It portrayed the emotional impact of slavery, which added greatly to the debates of slavery and abolition. Will Kaufman, an author of The Civil War and American Culture, quoted saying that this book helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. March 20th, 1852, an initial print of 5,000 copies of the full book were made, and in less than a year, it sold an unprecedented 300,000 copies. In November of 1853, a play based on that book opened in New York. Some of the main characters, Uncle Tom is one. He's initially seen as a noble, long-suffering Christian slave, though Uncle Tom, that name, has recently, in the past 100 years or so, become more of an insult to the African Americans who are seen as selling out to the whites. Throughout the book, Tom stands up for his beliefs and is even grudgingly admired by all of his enemies. Eliza, another great character in the story, is a slave and personal maid to Mrs. Shelby. Her story includes her escaping to the north with her 5-year-old son, Harry, after he is sold to a different house. Her husband, George, eventually finds them in Ohio. They emigrate to Canada, France, and then finally back to Liberia. And one of the favorites in Uncle Tom's Cabin would be Eva, or Evangeline St. Clair. She's a 5 or 6-year-old little girl and enters this narrative when Tom is traveling via steamship to New Orleans to be sold. She falls off the ship, and Tom saves her from drowning. After this, Eva begs her father to buy Tom, which he does. And throughout whenever he's near Eva, she has a profound impact upon everyone that's around her. She always speaks of love and forgiveness, convincing even Topsy, who's a very dour slave girl, that she deserves love. To speak about her impact, or to prove her impact, within a year of this book being published, over 300 babies were named Eva in Boston alone. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel in the 19th century, second only to the Bible. Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, and the legend has it that he greeted her saying, "So this is the little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War." In summation, this is a sentimental novel depicting the reality of slavery while also asserting that Christian love can overcome something as destructive and despicable as the enslavement of fellow human beings. This novel is still widely read and studied in colleges and schools everywhere. Harriet Beecher Stowe passed away at the age of 85 in Hartford, Connecticut, and is currently buried in the historical cemetery at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. I love Harriet Beecher Stowe, but I will pick favorites and say I like Louisa May Alcott more. Louisa May Alcott was an American novelist born November 29th of 1832 in Germantown, PA, which is currently part of Philadelphia. She's best known for Little Women and Little Men, though she did write quite a few other books. She's the second of 4 daughters, was homeschooled but received education, which I'm jealous of, from the likes of Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Margaret Fuller. As an adult, she became an abolitionist and a feminist. And in 1847, her family housed a fugitive slave for 1 week. In 1848, she read and admired the Declaration of Sentiments published by the Seneca Falls Convention on Women's Rights. She was actually living in poverty and went to work at an early age as an occasional teacher, seamstress, governess, domestic helper, and writer. Her first book was called Flower Fables, published in 1849, a selection of short tales that was originally written for Ellen Emerson, the daughter of Ralph Waldo. In 1860, she began writing for the Atlantic Monthly, though when the war broke out, she did serve as a nurse for 6 weeks in the Union Hospital at Georgetown. Her letters were later collected and published as Hospital Sketches, which brought critical recognition for her observations and humor. It is notable that while she was working as the nurse, she did contract typhoid fever and was I want to say. She was given a compound to heal her that contained mercury. She also wrote various stories under the pen name A.M. Barnard, which were filled with protagonists who were willful, resentful, and relentless in their pursuits, which often included revenge. Little Women, one of my favorite books of all time, was published in 1868. It's a semi-autobiographical novel about her childhood with her sisters in Concord, Massachusetts. The main character, Jo, is based upon herself. Though whereas Jo marries in the end of the book, Alcott did remain single, and in an interview when asked why this was, she said, "Because I have fallen in love with so many pretty girls and never the least bit with any man." However, she did have a European romance, detailed in her journals, though later she tried to delete those. Before her death, she identified Laddie as her model for Laurie, with whom Jo does fall slightly in love with in Little Women. In 1879, Alcott took in her niece after her younger sister Mary died, and they were both named Louisa May, though had different nicknames. Later in life, Alcott became an advocate for women's suffrage and was the first woman to register to vote in Concord, Massachusetts, in a school board election. Earlier, when I mentioned that she had contracted typhoid fever, she suffered from chronic health problems throughout her life, and a lot of it was, at the time, contributed to that cure that contained mercury, because they thought she had mercury poisoning. Although recent studies suggest that she may have had an autoimmune disease, including lupus, as if you look up various paintings of her, she does have the rash on her face. She died 2 days after her father, at the age of 55, of a stroke. Her last words were, "Is it not meningitis?" And she died on March 6, 1888, at 3:30 a.m., and is currently buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts.
Going on, I am going to try to give you a little bit of a feel for Mary Boykin Chestnut, and I'm sure that you all are quite aware of who she is, as she did a diary, and all of her memoirs or her diary have been written in various different books at various different times, making different minor adjustments so that it was more readable. Mary Chestnut was a fairly wealthy Southern woman who enjoyed her wealth, enjoyed being a Southern woman, and definitely had her opinions on things. One thing that she didn't really care about was the fact that she married into a family that had, the father-in-law owned like 7 or 8 plantations. And she met her husband when she was 13 years old in a girls' school. He came to visit, and then throughout the next 3 or 4 years, he kept writing her all these love letters. Kept asking her, "Will you marry me? Will you marry me?" And she kept putting him off, putting him off, putting him off. And finally, she did marry him and found that she was going to be very, very wealthy with slaves, house slaves and all. Apparently, she was pretty good at being a mistress of the house, but sometimes her temper got the better of her and she would whip her slaves. She loved her husband, but hated the fact that he would ask her something, she'd start to say something, and then he'd shut down, back right off. She'd ask him something, and he'd go around about the question and never give her an answer. So this frustrated her to no end. And she wrote on several different occasions about how her husband would frustrate her, and about different slaves and slavery, she thought, actually, that Uncle Tom's Cabin was just tomfoolery because she thought the author knew nothing about slavery at all, because she was a northern woman and she wouldn't know about that. She had little patience sometimes for different people. I must say that I was absolutely amused at the fact that she went up on the roof when Fort Sumter was under fire, and they knew it was coming because her husband was in the war, and she got word that they were going to fire because the Union wasn't going to give up Fort Sumter. And so they had a deadline of 4 o'clock in the morning. So all that night she slept restlessly, back and forth, and finally 4 o'clock came and nothing happened. So she thought, oh, they must have given up, so we've got Fort Sumter. No sooner had she laid her head back on the pillow than boom, she heard the cannon start to fire. And they ran up to the rooftop and they all watched. All these women ran up and they all watched. All over the city they were watching the fire going back and forth and back and forth. When dawn came and daylight came, they all got word that nobody was killed, but they were still under siege. And so life went on. The next night she decided, and most of the women decided they wanted to go on the rooftop again because it really was a glorious sight to see, just like we would look at firecrackers and fireworks going up, all this firelight and everything. And so they all went up on the roof. And she writes this: last night, or this morning, truly, up on the housetop, I was so weak and weary. I sat down on something that looked like a black stool. Get up, you foolish woman! Your dress is on fire! Cried a man. And he put me out. I was on the chimney, and the sparks caught hold of my clothes. But my fire had been extinguished before it burst into a regular flame. I loved that passage. And there's more passages that she writes about different things. One of the other things that she wrote a lot about was her beliefs on men and the fact that the plantation owners, she really despised her father-in-law for this, going out because the cabins out there were so close and sneaking out to be with their female slaves and creating a lot of children. That she said you would look at, you know who the father is, but you don't speak of it, you don't talk of it. And she wrote several different things about that, especially about her father-in-law. And let me see if I can find this one passage which I thought was absolutely lovely, and how she talked about her father-in-law. They were talking also about Uncle Tom's Cabin at this point, and they were talking about Mr. Legree and everything, and that Miss Stowe, she don't know nothing. It's the man's wife and children stops or suffers. When men are so bad, that's where the trouble comes in. She says that Mr. Chestnut, which is her father-in-law, lived to 90 years. And he would go out, and she wrote, would talk about the children, the mulatto children that he had, and was very, very angry that men could do that, but heaven forbid if a woman went out on a man, she'd nearly be stoned. But she wrote about this and was very, very angry. So she had her feelings on slavery, which she thought was their right to have. Her feelings on men, she loved her husband dearly, but they don't talk to the women, and they act as if women are stupid. Any woman in here stupid? No. That they would go out, cheat on their wives, and have all these mulatto children, and yet these children then went out and they could be sold. So she had her feelings on those things. Mary Chestnut was a wonderful woman and gave us many, many passages about what the Civil War was like, about looking out on the fort when it was being fired upon, about her slaves and how she felt about them, about life, being married, having children. So if you get a chance, I would recommend that you read Mary Chestnut's diary. There are a multitude of different publishers and the way it's published, but it's an excellent book. That gives us an excellent picture. And my husband's back to talk about Angels of Mercy.
Let me start this off just a little bit differently than I expected to, which is one of the things that in every war we've had a part in, we somehow seem to discover at the beginning or somewhere during the middle of that, wow, African Americans can fight. That's amazing. How'd that happen? They discovered that in the Revolution. Somehow they forgot about that during the War of 1812, and somehow they forgot about that during the Civil War, and somehow during the wars on the plains and during World War I and World War II. Somehow we discovered during all of those things that those guys can fight and bleed just as well as anybody else. And similarly, Clara Barton was one of those people who forced people to realize that women, gosh, they won't faint dead away when they see a guy bleeding. They can actually take care of people. What a revelation. Before people like Clara Barton and the two people that Kathy's going to get into as well, frequently women were looked on, if they were hanging around a hospital, as nothing better than prostitutes, or camp followers, if you will. Camp followers are the people that have followed every army since the beginning of time and have provided everything from supplies to comfort to whatever the soldiers needed. But that clearly wasn't who Clara Barton was. Before the Civil War, she was a patent officer, one of the few women to be appointed to that kind of position, and as soon as somebody realized she was getting paid as much as the men were, well, that got taken care of. And then during the Civil War, completely as a volunteer basis, she started to ferry supplies out during particularly the battle at Antietam, or if you're a Confederate, Sharpsburg. Also survived a case of typhoid fever. I don't know if you're aware, but they've been revising the figures on how many people died during the Civil War. The current figure is somewhere above 700,000, which given the population of the United States at the time is a pretty considerable figure. But I'm guessing even that is low because I'm thinking they're just counting the soldiers who died. Never mind the people who were forced out, let's say during the Shenandoah Valley campaign, when they burned almost every farm they could find to cut off the Confederacy's breadbasket. So in terms of civilian casualties, I don't know that we'll ever be able to get an accurate figure on that. But getting back to Clara Barton, she managed to, with great reluctance on the part of the men who were involved, take over care and took meticulous notes for the last 3 years of the war. And if you've read anything about her, by the way, I don't know if you've, I'm going to apologize. I was going to read a poem that she wrote, and it's a wonderful poem, and I hope you look it up. I'm sure it's somewhere online. Unfortunately, this library, and I'm not picking on the library because they only get the books you get, but most of them seem to be young adult or juvenile. And I'm not sure why there isn't a more popular biography of Clara Barton, because, boy, if you're looking for a Hollywood story, her story and the women that are about to follow, you got a mini-series on every one of them. And it would not be just the Oxygen Channel. We're talking life and death. Clara Barton was tending to an officer. She handed him a cup. Bullet passes through her sleeve and hits him, killing him. She was out there. You don't get any closer to the front than she was. And she earned that title, Angel of the Battlefield. We all know her, at least the way when I was growing up. Oh, wow, she's the lady who started the Red Cross. Yes, and she did it in large measure from her summer home in Dansville. But you also ought to know that in addition to her good work with the American Red Cross, she was good friends, with all that meant, with Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. So this is a person who had a very rich life, did a lot of different things, survived long odds. And again, why we don't know more about her, I'd love to know. There's a historical curriculum out there just waiting to be done right, I think. But enough of that politically. Let me have her tell you a little bit more about Dorothea Dix and Marianne Bickerdike. And if you don't know anything about Mother Bickerdike, she's a character.
If I had to choose who I would like to portray in the Civil War, one of these two women would be it, definitely. Partly because of their wonderful nicknames. Now, Dorothea Dix organized nurses. Prior to the Civil War, only men were nurses. There were no female nurses because, as Wyatt said, they thought that women would, they would faint at the sight of blood. But Dorothea Dix knew better. She knew that there were women out there that were strong and able-bodied and wanted to do something for the cause. So she organized females, women. One of the things that made it so special for her is that she was a friend of the Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward? I know, I never pronounced that right. On April 21st of 1861, she visited the Surgeon General to propose that she organize women to come and help in the field hospitals because they were coming in, the wounded were coming in fast and furious, and the males just couldn't keep up. There were so many wounded coming, and they were wounded in such ways that they couldn't keep up. They couldn't keep up with the bandages, they couldn't keep up with the cleaning, they couldn't keep up with anything that was going on, and the surgeons were having a hard time also. So she said, let me get the women in there because there's not enough men to mop up the blood. So she turned her own home into a kind of supply hospital and wrote to a lot of different newspapers all around the northern area begging for supplies for the war and gave her own address. Now she rented this house, but gave that address. So all these supplies came in and they were coming fast and furious. Pretty soon her house was full. She couldn't even live there. She had to rent another house in order to get, to live and have the supplies. So she had a lot of women come to take care of those supplies, to divide them up, to send them to the hospitals that were needed. And she was, thanking the public, and just, it was wonderful. All these supplies came in. Now, she also went to her friend and said, now look, I know that, I've taken supplies to this hospital and this hospital and this hospital and this hospital and this hospital. Why don't you just have one central place? You've got a building that's perfect for it. The hotel down on such and such a road. So, yeah, we'll look into it. Well, she got her friends up at the top and told them, hey, let's get this going. And sure enough, that hotel was made into a hospital. And she was notified of her appointment because she also went asking for some kind of passes to go wherever she needed to, and she wanted to get an appointment to be able to be commissioner of supplies so that she may be able to get places, get the supplies, and they would know, and she would have an official paper. So April 23rd, she was given by the War Department an official appointment as the superintendent of women nurses. And so she then sent out notices for women saying, okay, they've accepted, they want women to volunteer, would you come and volunteer? And she personally oversaw interviewing and accepting or declining every single woman. And what did she say they had to be? They couldn't be single and pretty. They had to have had experience. So it was better if they were mothers of older children. And she made sure that they were dressed appropriately, most likely in dark brown, dark green, dark black, plain. She didn't want them to get the boys all excited. So she would make sure that they were dressed appropriately, and then she sent them to the hospitals that were needed, along with supplies. And so she also, again, sent out letters to the different papers saying, these are the supplies we need. We need this kind of food, and we need these bandages. We need clothing so that I can get women started on sewing all of the different uniform. Hospital shirts are needed. And so she sent all of these papers, all of this, and all these supplies came, and she continued with all of her women nurses and women volunteers to take these supplies to where they were needed, to make sure that the boys were taken care of, and to make sure that everything was scrubbed and clean. She also, amazingly enough, had some experience with the Crimean War, so she knew exactly what was really needed. She had some experience there. As she went places, she also gave wonderful speeches, and she collected at one point $500,000. Now imagine that. I mean, that to me, that's a lot of money these days. I can't imagine what that would be back then. That was just unbelievable. She also petitioned for the women to start being able to get paid. The male nurses were making $20 a month, getting their room, getting their board, getting everything paid for, and this $20 was free and clear. Her female nurses, zero. So she petitioned them and finally got them approved to get 40 cents a day, and they would still have to pay for their traveling expenses, their own clothes, and their own food. I don't know about you, but I don't think 40 cents even then would have gone for very much. She was known by most of the people there as the dictator in a petticoat, because she didn't put up from flack from any surgeon, from anybody. She would use her knowledge and her friendships from those in the government, and it would come down, and they did what she said. So this little dictator went around and took care of our boys, the boys in the Civil War, and eventually, as the Civil War started winding down and came to a close, and she found that she had applied for a pension or whatnot from the government. Unfortunately, all they wanted to give her was a plaque, so she swallowed her pride, and she got the plaque. One thing that I thought was really good was something that my husband had mentioned that Clara Barton did. She went out on the fields also, and at one point she found a wounded soldier. She picked his head up, and she got her water, and she just got it to his mouth when a bullet came, hit him in the head. He shuddered, and he died. She gently laid his head down and went to the next soldier. And for her, she didn't care if they were in gray or they were in blue. She took care of them out of the battlefield. So she deserves an awful lot of credit. The other person that I would like to portray, or if I had a chance to portray, is Mary Ann Bickerdike, also known as the two-legged cyclone, the cyclone in calico, or Mother Bickerdike. Now, Mary Ann Ball Bickerdike was a Quaker. She had been married already 12 years and had some children. Her husband, unfortunately, dropped dead, and she had gone and had been trained in Cincinnati as a skilled nurse. So she decided that she was going to volunteer and go into the service, and at one point she picked up what little money she had and supplies that she had gathered because she went to her minister in her church, and they gave her supplies and they gave her some money, and she went to the nearest field hospital that she could find. And on August 7th of 1861, she ended up in Cairo, Illinois. And there are stories that they say they remember this two-legged cyclone when she hit, because she's carrying her stuff in, and along walks a gentleman, and she looks and she says, "Drop it." And he's a lieutenant, and he's thinking, I'm not dropping anything. So she grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and she pulled him, and she looked at the letters that were on his collar. And then, behold, Mother Bickerdike looked at his underwear and saw the initials there. And she was so angry, she told him to take them off. And he refused. This little woman, she grabbed a hold of him and she slammed him on the floor, and she sat on top of him and she said, "You remove those right now." She rolled him over, and he finally conceded and took those off, and she said, "You're not worthy to wear those. You're not wounded. This belongs to our men in the field hospital." That was a cyclone. So I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I love a woman with vim and vinegar that's going to just tell those guys right off and what they need to do. And she did. She did. She also was another person who went out and got a lot of supplies, went to the different places, gathered them up, brought them back, got the men taken care of. And one of the things that she did when she went to the field hospital was she gave each of those ill boys a clean set of sheets. But before they could put those clean set of sheets on, she took those boys that were able to walk over to a tub, said, "Strip it," made them take a bath and scrubbed them down and scrubbed their clothes and made sure they were clean, gave them clean sheets, and said, "Now you can go back to bed." Within 3 days, she had one entire field hospital totally clean, scrubbed. All the men, all the beds, all the floors, all the equipment. And then she went to the next field hospital and did the same thing. By the time she reached the third field hospital, she was so angry because everyone she went to was dirtier than the last. So she finally went up to the powers that be and said, "How can you let your men live like this?" And, of course, they really didn't know her and didn't want to take orders from her, so they poo-pooed her, but eventually she got through because she kept going to the next person and the next person up in the row until she got them to listen. And she went to Chicago and brought back, when she went, linens, clothes, lots of jams, jellies, eggs, live chickens, and iodine and money, things that they really needed. And she brought it to these field hospitals to make sure that they had what they needed. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman. She made sure that after the war, she helped secure men's pensions. And she was offered a pension of $25 a month. She also, during her escapades, rode a white horse. His name was Old Whitey. And at the end of the war, when they had a review of the troops, and 45,000 men went along, She was at the head of that line, riding her white horse, Old Whitey. And he was all draped in forget-me-nots. And that's Mother Rickard.
All right, if we're going to hit the rest of these folks, we're going to have to speed it up just a little bit.
Sorry, I'm long-winded.
Not at all. Not at all. What can't you say about Harriet Tubman? About 16 years ago, WXXI did a documentary called Flight to Freedom. And one of the things you realize when you do a program of that type is that there's so much stuff we'll never know about the Underground Railroad because, well, it was against the law. And they didn't exactly have signs outside going, "Stop here" on the Underground Railroad. And that's why when people say, "Oh, we've got this secret room in our house and it must have been," well, no, it doesn't have to have been. The state historian of Pennsylvania said to me that there was more than a couple people, very well-intentioned, mean well, who took him into their basement and said, "Now, we've remodeled, but you could see right where the tracks went through." Not really a railroad. One of the things that documentary allowed me to do was see where Harriet Tubman, who was born Araminta Ross, she later on took her mom's middle name, or her mom's name, where she grew up. And it's one of the things that when you drive that distance makes you just gasp at the idea that here's a person who, despite having a head wound early in her life that caused her to have narcolepsy and to have severe visions and seizures. This is somebody who, over the course of years, led, and it's hard to say how many. I've seen everything from 9 to 19 trips. But you're talking about going from at least Maryland back up to Canada. Think about walking that just once, and mostly at night, and sometimes with a price tag of $40,000 on your head. That's a lot of money. It's hard to imagine. But during the Civil War, she didn't exactly stop. In addition to being a nurse, she was also recruited to work on a campaign in the Carolina coast, and she is credited as being the only woman to plan and lead a mission, which in this case liberated at least 700 slaves. She went on a number of other missions behind enemy lines and got information on troop dispositions, supplies, as I say, nursed the sick and the wounded, later helped establish Freedmen's Bureau and helped slaves who were now becoming free to trust the Union soldiers, which in some cases wasn't an easy sell. And despite all of that, it took the federal government 30 years to grant her a military pension. And despite the kind of life she led, she lived to be I'm trying to think now, be 90 years old. She died in 1913. And if you visit her grave in the Fort Hill Cemetery down in Auburn, her tombstone's really kind of a model of simplicity. It says, "Servant of God, well done," which I think kind of sums it all up. And then you get somebody who's a vastly different person, who's Mary Walker.
You had alluded to Mary Walker, that they had met Mary Walker. Mary Walker was not the first female doctor. That goes to a British-born Elizabeth Blackwell. And she was certified as a doctor because they really didn't have licenses back then, 6 years before Mary Walker. Unfortunately, Mary Walker had a father who really wanted to be a physician but couldn't afford it. And he kept pressing her and telling her, "While you're under my roof, you won't wear any tight clothing." So no corset crossed the threshold of that household. And so Mary Walker literally learned to love pants, shirts, and the male garb. And her father pressed her to become a physician. So she literally became a physician and went to Syracuse University and graduated in 1855. It cost her $195 for 3 13-week courses. When you imagine that today, it takes doctors, wow, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years just in college, and then you've got your fellowship and everything else that goes along. They really do a lot more these days, but 3 13-week courses, and she became a doctor. Unfortunately, she found that there weren't too many people that wanted a female doctor. And it was hard for her to get any place, any office or anything. So she eventually went with a classmate, and they decided to get married. Needless to say, it wasn't a conventional wedding. Mary wore her black trousers and a beautiful white tux coat on the top. She also refused to say, "I obey," in her wedding vows, and married him. They set up an office in Oswego, and were in that office for about 2 years together. And unfortunately, she still couldn't get enough people that wanted to be with her. And she is the one who decided that she'd had enough of married life and told him to leave, so he left. She never took his last name, so she never had to worry about that. She finally set up her own office and advertised in the Syracuse newspaper that if you are looking for a female doctor, a choice away from a male doctor, then come see me. So she started to slowly build up a very small practice. When the war came out, she thought she'd had enough, so she figured that she wanted to get into the war, and she went and volunteered. Well, needless to say, they didn't want a female surgeon there, so they gave her nursery duties, and she was a nurse for like the first year of the war. Finally got tired of that and literally left that area since she was only a volunteer and went out west further, found a place where they would take her, and the one surgeon was glad because they were being overrun by wounded. However, the other surgeons that were in that practice, in that hospital, disliked her and said that she wasn't capable and didn't have the knowledge to take care of the wounded, so they made life very difficult for her. She continued on and did eventually serve a little bit more in the war doing these things, but generally never really got a full practice going. So after the war, she decided she was going to go on the circuit. And so she went on a talking circuit, and she went around everywhere talking about all of her wonderful things that she did within the Civil War and all the wounds that she saw and how she took care of the boys, et cetera, and continued to wear the male garb. And they did want to give her an award, and they did give her not a pension, but in place of the pension, they gave her the what do they call it? The star. Oh, heavens to Betsy. They gave her the medal of honor. And so she took that around with her everywhere. But then a group got together several years later and started reviewing all of these medals of honor that these people were gotten. And out of the 4,255 that got medals of honor, 911 were said that they didn't deserve it. So they went back to all these people to collect these medals of honor. And they came knocking at her door and said, "Hand it back." And she said, "Over my dead body," slammed the door in his face. So she kept her Medal of Honor, and she did eventually get buried with it. She died literally on the Washington Capitol steps at the age of 86. And they don't really know what she was doing there, but they presumed that she was either trying to increase her pension or talk about women's rights and voting. but that's Mary Walker.
All right, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of some spies. But again, I urge you to take a look at some of these women who really deserve a whole lot more attention, if simply because, as you'll see in some cases here, they were a pretty dramatic story. There's a woman named Elizabeth Van Loo who was born in Richmond, but grew up and was schooled in Philadelphia, where one of her her grandfather was the mayor. And she became a staunch abolitionist, which, as you might expect, wasn't something that would endear her to the neighbors. When her dad died, she and her mom freed their slaves, but almost all of them stayed on as hired people. During the Civil War, she would walk around and mutter to herself, and she'd be dressed in shabby clothing, and she and her mom would go visit the people at the Libby prison in Richmond. And of course, since she was, muttering to herself and dressed shabbily, people really didn't pay much attention to her, or if they did, she certainly wasn't taken seriously, and that's why they really didn't notice that what she was doing was giving all kinds of really good stuff to the soldiers, the Union soldiers who had been captured, many of them officers, and in return getting great information back about the Confederate troops who had captured these guys, and then passing all of that along back to Washington. After the war, she was rewarded for all of that by becoming the postmistress of Richmond. But of course, that meant that people now knew that she had been helping out the wrong side, in their view. And as you might expect, the neighbors weren't particularly happy towards her and treated her very badly. For the rest of her life, she died in poverty, unfortunately. I don't know why they call Belle Boyd the Cleopatra of the secession. That one just escapes me. But she was the eldest child of a middle-class family. And like this woman and the next two, you can take these with lots of grains of salt. They went on, two of these women went on to talk about their exploits on the stage for the rest of their lives. And so you might expect that they'd embellish just a little bit. Belle Boyd claims to have shot a Union officer for insulting her mother. She claimed to have hidden in a closet where she heard Union soldiers talking about what they were going to be doing. And as such, that's the information she passed on to a guy named Stonewall Jackson, who went on to capture the town of Front Royal. Which led him to make her into a captain and an honorary aide-de-camp. Belle was arrested and imprisoned at least 3 times for espionage. She wound up going to England. And can this get any more dramatic? Sure it can. Because the Union captain that had intercepted her boat going to England wound up falling in love with her, married her, got kicked out of the service, imprisoned. She wrote a 2-volume autobiography all about their exploits. He was eventually released. They had a kid. He died in 1866. She went on to have 2 other husbands, 4 kids, 4 more sons, and she wound up spending the rest of her life in full uniform, Confederate uniform, talking about her exploits on stage, which is where she died, in Wisconsin, in full uniform in front of gentlemen who had fought for the Grand Army of the Republic, and they buried her. Belle Boyd, this is her gravestone, Belle Boyd, Confederate spy, born in Virginia, died in Wisconsin, erected by a comrade. So at least they saw a kindred spirit in there.
Well, to start her life, she was quite a precocious child, because when she was approximately 8 years old, her family had a wonderful dinner party, and they had all of these guests downstairs, and she begged them, can I please come down to the party? And her father and mother said, absolutely not, you're not allowed to go, you're not old enough. So just at the end of the party, they heard all this commotion, and in through the door rides Belle Boyd on her pony, and looks at them all and says, I'm not old enough, but my pony is. Everybody laughed so hard that she didn't get into trouble, but I don't think her parents were very happy.
There's a woman named Pauline Cushman. Born in New Orleans, she grew up with 7 brothers in Michigan, and was an actress by the time she was 20. As they were touring Louisville, she was either paid or dared, or both, to toast to Jefferson Davis, which got her kicked out of her acting company. But it did give her a good idea, which was to feign being a Confederate sympathizer. And as such, she was able to get Confederate officers to tell her all kinds of things. And she was able to conceal battle plans and drawings in her shoes. Sometime she was found out and tried in a military court, sentenced to death 3 days before she was scheduled to be executed. A Union attack was able to free her. Supposedly awarded a brevet major by General, later to become President Garfield. And then she went on to go touring after the war. Boy, it must have been one heck of a circuit with all kinds of people out there telling these wonderful stories. But again, how much of a grain of salt do you need with this? Well, she toured for P.T. Barnum. Let me also tell you about one last one, and that's Rose Greenhow, who, if anything, was even more dramatic perhaps than the other 2 people I was talking about. She was born in 1813. 4 years later, her father was murdered by his own slaves. As such, she didn't turn out to be much of a sympathizer with abolition. She went on to be very well connected, even though she was orphaned at an early age. Dolly Madison was the person who gave her blessing to a marriage with Dr. Robert Greenhow. They wound up having 8 kids. Robert, her husband, died soon after the last one. And her Southern sympathies started to grow right after that, which is also coincidentally when the Civil War broke out. And she was able to give enough information, supposedly, and again, how much of this do I trust? Well, Jefferson Davis thought enough of her information about the First Battle of Bull Run that he gave formal notice of it. So Jeff Davis, I guess, probably knew what he was talking about. But she was, over the course of being later imprisoned, because Alan Pinkerton, who is now the head of the fledgling Secret Service, had her home raided, and they found maps of fortifications, they found battle maps, they found all kinds of things in her house. And despite being held captive in her own house and later at a formal prison in Washington, was still able to get all kinds of information out to the other side. She was finally released in May of 1862, deported, and then she went to visit Europe, where, among other people, she was able to visit with Napoleon III and Queen Victoria. And was sometime in her free time during that trip, she met and was engaged to the 2nd Earl Granville, and was coming back to give some dispatches to the Confederate government in October of 1864 when her blockade runner ran aground near the Cape Fear River. Rose, since she had dispatches, decided to not have those confiscated. She convinced the captain of the boat to get her a rowboat. She got into the rowboat. Unfortunately, along with the dispatches, she also had $2,000 in gold that she was supposedly going to be giving to the Confederate government, and she tied that around her neck. And that's what happened when your boat gets hit by a wave and you turn over. Guess what happens when you have $2,000 worth of gold? So yeah, she's now buried with full military honors, and what's on her tombstone is a martyr to the cause. All right, well, we wanted to talk very briefly also about some of the women who were soldiers, and then give you just a little bit of an overview of what it is that we're wearing and how that would have fit into the years of the Civil War, which we're going through the 150th anniversary of.
I'm going to try not to be as long-winded. I just love talking about these women because they are just so special. I'll give you a quick, brief view of, and I'm going to reverse these according to what's on down here. I'd already told you a little bit about how women became soldiers and that there was no physical exam. There was, however, a height requirement. It was 5 feet 8 inches. Unfortunately, as the war went on, and at first they had volunteers, after 3 months of people volunteering, they decided that they were going to lengthen it to 3 years. So a lot of the volunteers left. And since they left, they lowered the height requirement. So Jenny Hodges got in, and she was literally the shortest woman in the Army. She was in the 95th Illinois Infantry. She literally marched thousands of miles, was in 40 battles and skirmishes. She joined for the excitement, she said. However, again, earlier I think I alluded to the fact that the men in the service earned a lot more than you could being a laundress or anything like that. So she joined, and then afterwards decided that she really liked having the privileges of being a man. She liked the fact that she could vote. She liked the fact that she could smoke. She liked the fact that she could have her own bank account, which women could not do at that point. So because of the benefits of a man, she continued to dress as a man, and she was known in the war as Albert D.J. Casher, and continued to use that alias afterwards and lived as a man the rest of her life. She had various jobs after the war, and she even became not only a farmhand but a town lamplighter. And in one of her last job was for a Mr. Lish, and she was picking up different sticks and things and kind of trying to clear off his driveway. He didn't see her and ran her over. Needless to say, broke her leg. All this time, she'd been Albert. Albert, Albert, Albert. Unfortunately, the doctor realized Albert wasn't a he, Albert was a she. But because Albert was also getting a pension, they did send her to the Soldiers and Sailors Hospital in Quincy. And when they interviewed her, they asked her why she joined and asked her a little bit about her exploits. She wasn't as prolific with going around the circuit and talking. She just enjoyed the benefits of being a man and lived quietly all those years. And her headstone on her grave has both of her names as her female and her male counterpart, and she is buried in a very quiet little area in Savernum, Illinois. Another one that you can take with a grain of salt, as my husband alluded to, is a Loretta Velasquez. Cuban-born, came and was raised in New Orleans, married, wasn't really happy with her marriage, and decided that she was going to join the service, and her husband never knew. As she was in the service for the first while, the first husband died, and she says, because she wrote memoirs, etc., that she donned a fake mustache and a fake beard. You will notice that I don't have any fake anything on, but it is darkened, and I'll explain how I do that in a little bit. She says that she was a counter spy. She says that she killed men point blank. She claims that she broke the hearts of many women. She claims that she went to a hospital and found her lover, a Captain Charles DeCamp. Her disguise was so good, she says that he didn't even recognize her. She did eventually end up marrying 4 times, outlived 3 of them. The 4th one she married was extremely wealthy, and they lived in Austin, Nevada, and she finally died, a very wealthy woman with several children, in 1897, but wrote her memoirs. Again, there are historians that say, some of the things she tell me are a little bit far-fetched, so they don't believe it. Read her books, read about her, and decide for yourself. Is she telling the truth? Is she embellishing it? Or did she really do it? You have to decide. The last one, I would love to spend a ton of time on it, but I know we're low on time, is Sarah Edmonds, also known as Private Frank Thompson. She was born around Christmas time in 1841 in New Brunswick, Canada. Unfortunately, when she was born, her mother cried. Her mother had had one boy before that. Unfortunately, he had epilepsy, and all the rest of the children she had were girls. Needless to say, her husband was not very, very forgiving, and he used to abuse Mom and the girls. And at age 13, there was a 30-year-old farmer living down the road that said he wanted to marry her. Papa said, absolutely yes, you can have her. Mama said no and helped her get out of town and got her an alias of Frank Thompson. She sold Bibles for a long time and was very successful at doing it, but one day she found that everything was stolen. The only thing she had left was $5 and one Bible. So she used that $5 and that one Bible, and she came to America. She settled down to Hartford, Connecticut in 1860, went into the Bible Publishing Corporation, gave them her name, and they said, oh yeah, you're the most successful Bible salesman we had up there. So they automatically gave her a job, gave her money, gave her a place to live, and so she started selling Bibles again. She got tired of this. Selling Bibles was just tiresome. So after a while, she decided, I need something to do different. And in order to thank her new country, she decided to join when the Civil War came in. And she went in as Frank Thompson, Private Frank Thompson. Did fairly well. Got to know quite a few people. Wanted to do nursing, and they gave her an area which wasn't really seeing much action, so she went to another place and found more action, and a Colonel Orlando Poe made her a mail carrier so that she could come to and fro and do different things. But the most exciting things that she did were when she decided she would volunteer to be a spy for the Union. This woman went to such dramatic lengths as to literally have a barber cut off her entire head of hair, used silver nitrate solution and colored her entire body from here up, as well as her bald head, with silver nitrate to turn it black, did that with her hands up to her elbows, bought slave clothing and the willow bark shoes, which she said it took like 5 layers of oil to even get them to squinch a little bit to fit her feet. She didn't have a wig to wear, so she ordered one from Washington. She ordered a white, curly wig that she put on, and then she called herself Ned. She went and walked down to the southern lines, got in with some slaves down there, went with them, and they were told to do their duty. And she wasn't doing anything. Ned wasn't doing anything. So one of the generals looked and said, how come that, and I won't use the word, ain't doing nothing? So gave her a pick, gave her a wheelbarrow, said, go out with them and make the parapets and do what you need to do to get us our front line there. Poor thing, she never had done hard work. So by the end of the day, her hands were blistered, raw. She almost fell off of the plank that went up, that she was trying to get the wheelbarrow with all of these rocks and things up there, and almost fell over, and the slaves had pity on her and caught her. One of the slaves looked at her and said, hey, Nettie, ain't you turning white? And she said, oh, I figured I was going to be white because my mama has white in her background. Ran over, tried to find a mirror, found a mirror, realized, oh my God, the silver nitrate's wearing off. Grabbed some more silver nitrate and polished herself all back up. in doing all of this, she listened, and she wrote down things, hid it in her shoe, and when the time came, found her way back to the Northern lines, went up to General George McClellan, said, "I got," and he said he didn't know who this was, and said, "Get that away from me." So she went back, put chalk all over her, then went back and said, "I'm Frank, I'm Frank." Gave him all the stuff, and he accredited her with helping to win that portion, that battle. She did several other areas in which she disguises. She disguised herself as an Irish peddler. She disguised herself as a widow, and all these different things, and they go into detail in what she did to disguise herself, all the things that she did. Phenomenal, phenomenal woman. And she did all this as a disguise as a man. And I think of all the things, all the women, she was one of the most interesting I've ever gained knowledge about. She was wonderful, and I really encourage you to read about Sarah Emma Edmonds.
We'll take just a couple more minutes. We got all dressed up, we might as well tell you why. Although, one quick fact, the woman she was just talking about is Canadian. Any idea how many Canadians served in the American Civil War? Within 10,000? The best guess is between 40 and 50,000, which our friends who serve as reenactors from Canada are very quick to tell you. What's wrong with this picture? What three things am I doing wrong if I want to be an authentic Civil War reenactor? Don't have my hat.
Although you'd have it off because we're in a
In
building.
here, but I have to have a hat.
Bad.
Supposed to be buttoning this. And I probably wouldn't be having these down. Also, I don't have a uniform jacket on. And if I had a uniform jacket on, it would probably not be gray. It would probably be butternut. Why? Because they ran out of gray. Early in the war, gray was the preferred choice. I mean, they didn't have a standardized uniform until after the First Battle of Bull Run. But butternut was the preferred color, the only color really that they had for much of the rest of the war. That's the only thing they had in abundance. It was hickory nuts, butternut, whatever you want to call it.
Mainly the soldiers from Tennessee and Kentucky wore the butternut.
If you want to be a reenactor, and I can tell all of you are desperate to do this, the only things you really need as a, in our case, colorist, would be your hat. You'd have what we call a haversack, which is something you carry your stuff in. Nice day like this, you'd have that. You'd probably have an oilcloth. This is a ground cloth. This is a raincoat. And that's about it. That's really all you need in addition to wool socks. These are called brogans. And luckily, we are able to loot things off of the Union so that we can identify, we can attire ourselves in lots of different ways.
The other thing is each soldier would carry a half of an A tent, and so they would wrap that tent in their oilcloth and carry it on their back. So they were carrying not only all of their rifles or pistols or whatever they had, their knives and everything, they'd have that on their back. And in here, the men would carry, if they wanted to shave, a straight razor, maybe a pocket mirror. In mine, I also have my Bible. And this is actually a Bible from 1862. So I have my New Testament that I carry with me.
If you want to know something about reenacting, I'll tell you this very quickly. I cannot more highly recommend this book. It's called Confederates in the Attic. It's circa 1999, I think, 1998, somewhere around there. 1998. The gentleman, by the way, here that's on the cover, they had some pictures of him last June in Time magazine. One of his talents is he's able to make himself look like he's 3 days dead. Apparently he can bloat himself up so that he looks like he's a corpse out in the field who's been there quite a time. Why that should be a talent he discovered, I don't know. But it's a fascinating book by a guy who woke up one day to find a bunch of Confederate reenactors on his lawn. And he thought, oh, there's a great idea for a book. Half the book is about reenacting. I'll get back to that in a second. The other half is his tour around the South, where, again, a lot of people still feel that that War of Northern Aggression really has not come to an end. But in terms of reenactors, you have some people, like the guy we saw 4 or 5 years ago walking out to the battle at Hamlin, on his cell phone going, yeah, oh, the battle's about to start. Our group is in the middle of things. This guy here is at the very far end of the one I was just talking about. This guy is one of the people who, in order to properly pay tribute to the people that we are trying to portray, you want to have your uniform stand up at the end of a summer. You want to eat hardtack. You want to eat salt pork. You want to have maybe lice moving around. You want to smell the way they did. You might even want to go barefoot, because that's what they did a lot. Our group is of the mind that A, some of us are of a certain age, and B, and I brought a, no, I didn't even bring that in with me, did I? Well, I'll use this. We walk around with these, among other things. Any idea what's in here? There you go. What's in here?
Coffee, beer, liquor, chicory.
You could be right on all of those. But you don't know. What we'll do at the end of a battle is we'll walk into our tent and we'll open up our authentic Civil War cooler, which we've hidden underneath some authentic blankets and things.
And that is the one thing, our group does want us to look the part. If you bring a cooler, if you bring an air mattress, it's got to be covered, because the public, when it comes, our group believes that we should look the part.
When you get up on Saturday morning at 6 a.m., you walk out of that tent dressed this way. And that means everything. I'm not going to talk about underwear, but there are places that do an underwear check. There are some battles that are that precise. But when we go into the tent and pour a beverage into here, you don't know what's in there. I can drink whatever I want to out of something authentic. If you need an authentic Civil War air mattress, if they don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Far be it from me.
Yeah.
So they're Farbies.
Well, yeah. There are people who list folks that way. I like to think that if we've dressed the part and we are in character, and you don't see any of the things that are inauthentic, it didn't happen. So the other things I'd like to show you, my sister and my daughter will give you some idea of why a lot of women prefer to play men in reenactments.
And one thing also to know is that they are portraying wealthy women. Majority of the women that lived in that day did not have hoop skirts, because far be it if you were out in the field running your husband's farm, trying to run around in a hoop skirt and plow the fields. No way. Generally, they just had a single piece dress that they wore, calico, and
Not
out
this?
they go.
Oh, no. I'm actually going to do a minor strip, if you mind. She's actually wearing ones that are on there, but
No.
let's see. First, I will start with the bonnet. Women had to have their head covered. If it wasn't by a bonnet, it was by something to cover your hair, and your hair was not to touch your neck. It was always up. Didn't have bangs, didn't have earrings, especially not 3 of them. And
They
didn't
could have dangly
they
earrings,
could
but
have
not
dangly
posts.
earrings, and most of the time they were never clip-ons. Yeah. So I'm very inauthentic currently because of the fact that I was brought into this Friday night, which is why my presentation sounded like a book report. So,
The other thing about their hair is that they used to save all of the hair from their combs, and they used to make robes. They would roll it and rove it until they had enough so that they could put it underneath and roll their hair over it, And that's how they got those wonderful buns that literally would cover their ears, because that was another thing. Hair always was to cover the ears.
You've got the cape. My mother actually made me one out of heavier canvas material that I do use as a blanket when I'm there. Most of the time during reenacting, I will be a guide because, again, as I said to some people earlier, if I have the chance to shoot a cannon or just shoot a gun in general, I'm going to take it. I was raised by mostly guys, and it's fun. But for the Saturday nights, this is my mother. Saturday nights they have balls, and I do have a ball gown, and I will go dressed as a woman as well. This would be just a day dress. These would be pinned together, or you would have
Possibly wood buttons.
Yeah,
all
wood
buttons were made out of wood, ivory, or metal.
So those were under sleeves if you didn't have a shirt to go under this. She's wearing them as well. The main fact is you would normally have 7 layers to go. Oh, I forgot this is actually...
By the way, if you think this sounds romantic at all, just picture trying to get into a porta potty.
Yes, I mentioned that to someone earlier.
Great fun.
Yeah, porta potties with hoop skirts, not a good time.
Although the advantage for women is if you don't wear regular underwear and you just wear the crotchless pantalettes, it is a little advantage, but not by much.
I'm not going to go that far. So you've got, what would this be called? Just the main
That's the main overcoat.
overcoat, which the bow fell off earlier, sorry.
That's all right.
You would have the main skirt.
I did not sew this outfit, by the way. I have sewn most of our clothing. This is one I did not.
And again, because I was brought into this Friday night, I do not have the over the hoop skirt, which would give more bounce.
And it will also
one?
cover the,
Is
it
that-
would also,
Oh, that's.
yep, she has hers on. It also covers the fact that if you have a regular skirt on over top of the boning sticks out. They didn't want the boning to show, so that's why they had an over the hoop petticoat.
Now, because there are so many different layers, it's kind of a draw between whether you want to be a man or a woman during the hot days, especially at Genesee Country Museum when we do this in July. I've continuously said to people, you know, the guys in the Civil War, most of them didn't have a choice. They went into this and they, you know, wore the wool or any of that. We pay to do this, to wear wool in July. And we do it in New York. You know, it never got much north of Gettysburg, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so, anyway, with the females, the nice thing is if you do this, it creates a very nice breeze. But you're also wearing a corset and a whole bunch of different layers.
Yes.
So you've got the hoop skirt on, then you would have another skirt underneath this.
Oh, my God.
These are the crotchless pantalettes. I'm wearing stockings underneath this. Black leggings, which normally they would only be thigh highs to about here. And these are actually quite risque as they're black with red ribbon. Also, if you had striped socks, that was also considered risque. You were not supposed to show your armpits, your ankles,
Your ear, the tops of your ears.
tops of your ears. They were supposed to be all covered. I was always amused by the fact that some of the ball gowns that they had would come down to about here, but you couldn't show your armpits at all. That was just no. So this is the over the corset, and then I'm wearing just a tank top underneath this because I couldn't find my under the corset one in mine. So here's the corset, and due to Civil War reenacting, I've gotten into corsets and I quite like them. They do help your posture, and it takes very much talent to learn how to slouch in them, which I've learned how to do.
You find them uncomfortable? I find them very comfortable. When I wear a corset, it is extremely comfortable.
But
If
also
you
puts
get
your
it
back
just
in
right
place.
and you get the boning in the right spot, oh, it's wonderful.
Puts
But
your
of course,
back
I have back problems too, so that helps.
She's wearing the correct shoes. Again, I couldn't find mine, but you would wear shoes like that or boots. Again, these are the crotchless panties, or pantaloons, I should say. And so it made it very easy for various things to happen. Then you'd wear the stockings, and then that was pretty much it. but you had 7 layers.
Camisole and.
Yep.
Yeah, under the
Camisole and
under
chemise
the
underneath the
camisole
top-
underneath, and then another camisole over top of there,
which is right there.
and
If you didn't have the bonnet, you could have a snood, which you would put over your hair.
the snoods at that time, though, the ones they have today that they are recreating, come in colors and come in a material that is not authentic. Pretty much the authentic snoods that they had were very much like the net, the very fine net hair nets that you'll find. More material like that. They did on occasion crochet their own snoods, so you would find them out of wool or out of another material that they would use to crochet. As far as for me being male, a lot of the females go out there, they are not as authentic. You know, they leave their earrings in, they leave their glasses on,
braids.
they, you know, have their French braids, or they leave it. If you want to be official, the men had short hair. The men also did not have, the women that dressed as men, again, would bind their breasts, would pad the pants. But for those that wanted to portray a male, they could take charcoal and use that on the fine hairs. Every woman has fine hairs on her face. And so if you use charcoal, or you use the materials that they used to do with their eyes, their, for lack of a better term, eyeliner, if you use that black, you can literally go along the fine hairs of your face and darken all the hair, which gives you that illusion of having a 5 o'clock shadow. Our unit likes to do that. There are many women in different units that reenact today that don't do that. We all like to do that because we want to look authentic. Because if you put on a fake beard and a fake mustache, you can tell it's a fake beard and a fake mustache.
All right. Well, I guess we'll call that a day, and if you've got any other questions for us, we'll be here as long as you want to ask us
This is not
questions.
fake. This is real. See, don't fake this. I just want to make note that today is Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and he was born where?
Kentucky.
Kentucky, not Illinois, where he came from as a senator. Also, in this week, he was declared a president, winner of the 1860 election. And 5 days later, Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy. So that's in today's paper in this date in history. Any questions, please? Or just come view the books. Thank you for coming.